So it's 10 minutes past 6, so maybe I just kind of kick it off. There's going to be no introduction, Joe. You need no introduction for this group, but because this will be recording for YouTubers, if you can please tell them about you and how you got where you are before we go through the book walkthrough.
Sure. My name is Joe Emison. I am currently the CTO and co-founder at Branch. We're at branch.com. We sell insurance only in the US, not in Canada anytime soon. We sell personal lines insurance. So you can currently buy home, auto, renters, umbrella, and then through some partners of ours, life, condo, landlord. And our goal is to, over the next few years, we're live in 33 states. But over the next few years should be live in all, or should be live in about 40 by the end of this year. By the end of next year, hopefully all 50 plus Washington, D.C., and selling all of the types of personal lines insurance in the U.S. So that's our goal. And just one other word on Branch. There is a little bit in the talk on Branch, but the thing that Branch does differently from other insurance companies in the US is we are structurally cheaper based upon our ability to bundle effortlessly. So in the United States, the vast majority of personal lines insurance premium are people who own homes and own cars. But if you don't use Branch, it'll take you hours or days to be able to buy a home and auto bundle policy, even though most people do it. And so they do it, it's really painful, and then they never want to shop for it again. And so they retain for 20 years. And so Branch is the first company that actually attacks that ease problem. And the fastest we've ever had anyone buy a home auto bundle is 37 seconds. And every year we have someone do it in less than a minute. And again, it's hours for anybody else. So that's basis set up on Branch. For me personally, this is my 6th startup as a technical co-founder. I have started companies in consumer electronics, hardware, software. I've done games. I have done small, medium-sized business software as a service. I've done enterprise software as a service. I've done government software startups, and I have taken over. I've been acquired into companies and become the CIO of a large company. I've been a consulting CIO, CTO, and I'm in my kind of 28th year of software development for money, let's say, or something in that neighborhood. I also, in the middle of all that, went to law school and have a JD as well, although I've never practiced law other than as a student lawyer. Starting about 20 years ago, I got very interested in how people were developing software. And I felt like there was a lot of just very poor decisions in software development. I actually remember being in college. I graduated from college in 2002. And I remember being in college and taking a software engineering course while I was a solo software developer, making a fair amount of money doing development, and thinking, like, this is awful. I cannot believe I am being taught this way, which was a very waterfall software development, a lot of like heavy specification work, things that nobody would embrace today. This is after the Agile Manifesto was signed, although obviously not well known at the time. I started getting more and more interested in different ways to develop software. When Amazon Web Services came out with EC2, I was starting a company and immediately started doing some things on EC2 and got very interested in the cloud and felt like I now had something to say. So I started writing articles on the cloud and giving talks on the cloud in 2011. And so I have steadily done more and more. And I've had enough moments where I have written an article and then I point back to it for years as, I come out with the article and everyone's like, huh? And then like 6 years later, I'm like, that article. And they're like, oh yeah, that's like totally like, right. Like you wrote that 6 years ago. And so I got to a point where I was like, I need to be more specific about putting a lot of these thoughts down. And so Vaughn Vernon, who is an author, writes a lot of domain-driven design books for Addison Wesley, owned by Pearson. And so he approached me and asked if I would be willing to work within his signature series and write a book on serverless. And Vaughn is great. He is highly skeptical of fads. I am very highly skeptical of fads. And so he said, you've been recommended to me. I don't get serverless. Tell me, like, what is serverless? It's like, how is it real? How is it a real improvement on how things are today? And so I spent a good amount of time with him and talked to him, and I convinced him. I think that, in fact, serverless is a very interesting way to do things and has a lot of benefits. And so he said, great, I'll endorse you writing this book. And so I started writing this book. Now, I have been building Branch full time. I am married with 3 children. And in the middle of this, I tore my Achilles tendon, which was like a very long rehabilitation process. So this book has taken me longer than I would have liked to put together. But it is done. It is in editing. And so I think, our goal is that it is able to, you can pre-order it now from Amazon and Barnes & Noble, but my goal would be that it's getting shipped out, within early 2023. But I don't have a firm date on that. And so there's a lot of review going on. But so my goal here, actually, this is the first time I will have talked through what the contents of the book are. And so my goal here is just to talk through the coherent argument in it. This is, I'm hopeful, helpful to me too. Certainly if you have questions, I would love to know them. And so this is like part of informing me as to things I think about as I go into the final edits of the book, as there will be a series of final edits. So anyway, there's my intro to me. Is that good, Dan? Should I do any more?
It's perfect. Stage is yours. You can say whatever else you want to say about the book or your work, or dive into the content.
Okay, yeah. Well, let me go in and talk about this so you can get a sense of what of the plan here and of what I have to say. And I think that we've struggled with the title of the book. I don't think any of us love, meaning my editor, me, Vaughn, love the title, although we can't come up with a better one. And so serverless as a game changer, we really don't have a better phrase than the goal here is to say that you can use serverless to build a more effective company, that there are actual business benefits, like significant business benefits to serverless. And specifically, I see serverless as on a spectrum and a journey that we have been going on from like co-location facilities. So if you think about the most extreme form of not cloud, it is I buy hardware, I buy a data center, I stick all my hardware in my data center, and I do everything that is involved there, right? I have to secure internet, power, etc. I view serverless as the end of that journey, where functionally what I'm doing is I write business logic and everything else is handled by managed service providers. That's the journey we've been on. There are plenty of people, though, who will tell you there's effectively no difference between serverless and Kubernetes, running a Kubernetes cluster, right? Or, there are plenty of people who would tell you, whatever, serverless is a gimmick, it doesn't mean anything. And by the way, there are plenty of ways to use serverless concepts to build completely useless, terrible architectures that you should never use. So, I mean, it's like any tool, you can misuse it badly. But anyway, so that's the story behind the title here, is that serverless can be used to change the game of your business. And it is how you get the most out of the cloud. It is the end stop on the journey. Like, we're there. I don't think that there are any more meaningful big steps we can take with respect to how we run infrastructure and how we develop. Well, potentially there's a world in which we don't need developers and product managers can just define the like imagine if you had a product manager and a designer and they designed and you made a design in Figma and you pressed the button and it just worked. I don't think that'll ever happen for a variety of reasons, but like that would be the next journey that we would be on. And I think for a variety of reasons, we're not going to get there. And so I think we're here. Like we've been on this cloud journey or this like co-location facility to serverless journey that involved virtualization for the last 20 some years. And we've made it to the end. And now we're in small amounts of optimization. And that's one of the reasons why, like, okay, great, I can write this book. I can take 2 years to write this book. It's not going to matter. Like functionally we're here. And by the way, functionally we're here, but the rest of the world isn't going to catch up and understand this for another decade. So we got time, right? This is still a meaningful advantage over 70, 80, 90% of how people are building, and it will remain that way for a while. Truly, and again, you can think of it as, enterprises are basically just now getting the benefit of what EC2 made available to us in like 2007, 2008. And using EC2 effectively in 2007, 2008 is basically along the line of the benefits that enterprises are getting out of the cloud today. So there's a lot of time to leverage this tech. All right. So let's talk. So what is this argument, right? The goal of this book is I got to put together this argument so that somebody who understands technology finds it to be a colorable argument. This is a reasonable debate. And yes, this person makes good points. The target audience for this book, by the way, is CEOs, CFOs, COOs, CTOs, VP engineering. The target audience for this book is not mid-level software developer. I mean, it could be, and maybe it's very useful for that, but this is a book that is targeted at business stakeholders who have fiduciary duties in an organization and whose compensation and success is tied to how well the business does or how well the organization executes as an organization, not somebody who views their job as how well can I execute some set of skills that I've learned. So someone who is like loves Kubernetes, draws a lot of self-identity around how they work with Kubernetes, and like just loves to get in there, or someone who loves to build distributed systems, like they're going to hate this book because it says that everything they do is actually antithetical to the success of their organization. Because we don't need to do that anymore, and we shouldn't. Like we shouldn't build power plants for our companies. We should just use the local power company. Or we shouldn't build our own internet connectivity. We should just connect to the local internet providers. But so the goal of this is people, the target audience are people who have actually a meaningful connection with the outcomes of their business. So, okay. So the book starts by helping explain what is the serverless mindset. So and this is a term, this is a phrase, I think, coined by Ben Kehoe. He has a good talk in which he talks about it. Now, the way he talks about it and the way I think about it are very aligned, but not identical. And so, I like to redefine how I think about it. But I think the important part of setting up the introduction this way is most people, when it comes to technology, will say, hey, there's this new technology, and let me describe what the technology is. And most people with serverless are going to say, there's a new technology called serverless, and it is, you write a function and you put it, and Amazon runs it for you, and it scales, blah, blah, blah. Like it's that sort of definition. That's not helpful from my perspective to helping the business leads understand how to think about serverless as the effective game changer serverless versus technology that can be misused and could get you none of the benefits that you want. So when I talk about the mindset, I first ask this question, which is, how many employees does it take to make an Anybody remember a social network called Yo? Any hands? Anyone remember Yo?
No.
So Yo is a social network that was created in 2014. And Yo had one function, which was you weren't allowed to send people different messages. You could just send a yo. So like if I connected with you, it was like poke, basically. I could just sort of poke. I couldn't say anything else. I could just yo. And this was a fad. It actually kind of blew up. Like a bunch of brands created like brand social media accounts on it. It faded away, raised some money from like relatively well-known venture capitalists. But the really interesting part about Yo is that it was built by a single developer and reached web scale with a single developer, and they were paying like $100 a month to parse at the time they blew up. And now parse is not nearly, I mean, parse is dead, bought by Facebook, shut down, original serverless backend. But the thing to think about is, up until that point in time, if you looked at Friendster or you looked at Facebook, and you looked at what it took to build a web scale program you could deploy and go viral, I mean, it was really expensive. And Yo had one person who wasn't even a particularly good programmer, built a web scale social network that just blew up. There's another example though that's almost as good, or maybe better, which is Instagram. At the time Instagram was acquired by Facebook for $1 billion, right? And this was when $1 billion was more than $1 billion today with startups, although $1 billion is still a lot of money today. It had 13 developers as employees, 13. Facebook had thousands, and it was so threatening to Facebook. Facebook had to buy it. And again, scalable. Again, Kevin Systrom taught himself how to program and built the original versions of it. So it is possible that there's also a former A16Z analyst who is now a product manager. I want to say it's Stripe, named Sam Gerstenstang, who wrote an article for A16Z's blog in which he asked, when are we going to have the first unicorn that has only one developer? Because it's possible. We have managed services now. So the thing I want you to ask, or the thing I want business leaders or organizational leaders to ask is, how many people does it really take to build something? And if you realize that you don't need that many people to build something, if you can envision, I can build this thing with a very small number of people, or I can build it with a lot of people, and just ask, what are the practical implications of those different outcomes? Most business leaders will agree, if I can build it with fewer people, everything will be better. It will be cheaper. It will be faster. It will be better. I will have more focus. I will have easier time communicating. All of these things. And this is just true. As your organization gets larger, either a department or the whole company, keeping everyone aligned, keeping everyone happy, keeping everyone on track, keeping everyone working in a similar way and in alignment and not factionalizing and having infighting. All of those things get a lot harder as you get bigger. So the serverless mindset then is to ask the question, how do we leverage technology as it improves so that we can work on the things that make us different and not work on anything else, right? How do I define in my business what I'm doing differently? And then how do I not do anything else? How do I hand all of those things to other managed services? And we do this all day. And even in software development, we do this all day with respect to some things. So like, I don't know many people who are buying telephony cards, shoving them in machines and putting them in their own data centers or co-location facilities to send SMS messages, right? We use Twilio. But for whatever reason, we don't do that with respect to a whole lot of other things that we can do in managed services because we like to write them, because we don't do the research, whatever it is. And so, we tend to apply like not the right lens, not the right mental model here. And so this book functionally is for people who say, this is an interesting point. If I could be Instagram, if I were doing Instagram again, or I were building a social network again, I would want to just focus on the things that make me different. And I wouldn't want to do stuff that I could use managed services for. And I'm okay with wherever that shakes out. If that means that I can't work on building distributed systems, that's fine, because I'm going to try to optimize for what this business needs. And most of the common objections that I hear are things like, what you're saying is that the job of a developer should be gluing APIs together, and that sounds terrible, and I won't do it. And my view is, great, go work for a competitor of mine, because we'll run circles around you while you're building shit that we don't have to. But that's the challenge. If fundamentally, if you're not a pragmatist, if you're not trying to optimize for business outcomes, I'm not speaking to you in this book. So here's the structure of the book. Part 1 of the book really talks about the serverless mindset. What is serverless? What isn't serverless? Okay, so definitional chapters, several chapters. Part 2 talks about branch, compares it to a hypothetical insurance company called InsureCo that is doing best practices everything today. So containers, best practices software development lifecycle, and then compares them and makes an argument that says branch is going to crush this from a business perspective, not from any sort of technical measure. From a business perspective, branch is going to beat this insurance company badly because of choosing serverless. Okay, so like the real core argument in here, and it's honestly the place where, as I am talking to people, as people tell me serverless is not a big deal, doesn't give you these advantages, really no difference from running containers. That's the series of chapters that I really want to have conversations with people on, because I think that in there, it becomes very obvious to me, and where I lay out this argument, although I'm sure people are going to claim some straw man aspects to my argument. So I'm really excited to work through all of that. And then finally, two more. So part 3 is, okay, I get it. I buy it all. Unfortunately, I got a bunch of servers and containers and crusty old IT people. And how do I get there? Because I don't see how I can get from where I am to serverless. And so that talks about a journey that I've tried to help companies on, some successfully, some not, and some of my thoughts on that. And then finally, part 4 is something that I feel is desperately needed in the world, which is a directory of managed services. I often find that when I am telling people, or when I'm asked to, I do get a fair number of people who say, hey, will you come into my organization, talk to my VP engineering, talk to my enterprise architects, talk to the CTO, and like just talk about serverless and convince them. And usually what I do is I'll ask questions around certain managed services that I know exist, and I'll ask if they have pain points. And then I'll say, well, for example, it sounds like you're using Elasticsearch because it's very finicky and has this problem. You have to make these proxies for access. And they'll go, yeah, it's a pain. And then I'll say, well, have you used Algolia? And they'll say, I've never heard of Algolia. And then I'll walk through Algolia. Well, you often pull up the website, play around with it, and then you'll just see everyone in the room say, this is going to solve all of our problems, right? Or this, like, we get it. Like, this would have been way. And sometimes you hear like, well, we can't get rid of Elasticsearch now because of, bad reason here. But, you hear like, I wish we'd known about this when we started. So this part 4 of a directory is a huge part of what I'm hoping, and hopefully we'll have a website for it and keep it up to date. But the goal will be, how do we let people know about, how do you find out what even exists out in the world? Because that is that ultimately, I think if people really knew what managed services were available, it would make that adoption of serverless that much easier. There is also part in part 4 that really talks about how I conceptualize the best serverless architectures. And so we'll touch on some of that here. So for the rest of me talking here, I'm largely going to talk about more part 1 in detail, and then the other parts in summary, and then I'm happy to answer any questions about anything. So, and then all of the slides will have this format, so it is somewhat boring, so hopefully my voice at least will modulate and be exciting. Okay. So, if we want to talk about business benefits of serverless, I think the best thing to talk about is to really understand cost of not using serverless, benefits of using serverless. And so there are tons of ways of classifying costs. I think it's very helpful to really have a coherent, rigorous mental model on the types of costs that we have in software development. So for example, direct costs are simple. They're what you spend on software development. Now, one of the great things to do is look at expensive failed software development projects. And so there's amazing projects in which, between, hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars were spent on software systems and they never actually went live, right? So we can think about like Cover Oregon as an example that Oracle got sued over as a result of Obamacare, right? It was a project to build the Obamacare portal for Oregon, and they spent $200 million and then never launched anything, right? And there's a bunch of these. So I have a listing of these. There's a good Wikipedia page on failed software projects, but those are direct costs. Direct costs you spend on developing software. Indirect costs would be things like electricity, internet, etc. Usually in software development, not enormous. Fixed costs, right, and these tend to be like infrastructure, right? So we can spend a lot on fixed costs, but not usually relative to developers. And so again, usually direct costs are more of a focus. Variable costs are ones that change relative to usage of software. And so in software, we have high variable costs, like when we give things away, right? Or where we have bad unit economics is generally where those focus, and sort of et cetera. So there's a variety of, I could go into more costs, happy to answer more of them lately. Those are kind of the main ones. There are several other ones that I define and lay out here. And the important thing to think about here when it comes to the serverless mindset is which of the costs of developing software are fundamentally undifferentiated. So the best way to think about an undifferentiated cost in software development is electricity. There's no reason for you to make your own electricity. Everyone hopefully can get on board with we should not build our own electricity. Again, if we go on that path, like co-location or running your own data center, again, that is generally viewed as an undifferentiated heavy lifting. Where we get into debates, right, are when it comes to is running Kubernetes, right, undifferentiated heavy lifting. I mean, that's a huge flashpoint today. And so a big part of the remaining chapters of the book are to set you up so that everyone can understand that is a pure undifferentiated heavy lifting. And I think the main question should be to ask, if you didn't have to run your own cluster and administer your cluster, wouldn't you be better off? And I think what most people say is yes, but everyone ends up having to. It's a little like everyone who has a mobile app sort of says, well, eventually you end up writing native iOS and Android apps because none of these ecosystems like React Native can actually sustain you in the long term. And I'll get to these managed. We'll go into lots of. I got a whole objection set, and then you can ask questions if I don't hit your objections you hear. But the really so the other lens to think about then in this context of costs and this context of undifferentiated heavy lifting is what is a liability and what is an asset. And so I'm a big believer in code as a liability. There is no benefit to having more lines of code. If you could have fewer lines of code and accomplish the same thing, right? If you have two systems, one that has 1 million lines of code and one that has 50,000 lines of code, and they do this exact same thing, then there's no asset in the additional lines of code that you would have. You want the fewer lines of code because you have to maintain it. You got to keep working with it. You got to train people on how it's used. Sorry, there is a fire alarm going off in my house. I'm sure that it will be handled shortly. The real question, though, is what is the asset? And so my view on this, sorry, this is driving you nuts. How loud is that fire alarm for everyone else? Just out of curiosity.
It's okay. We cannot.
It's fine. Okay. All right. Great. Okay, it's off. Good. My view is the asset is the experience that you have. It's the knowledge that the team has. It's everything you bake in to what you've built. There is a great series of articles about whether or not you should rewrite software. So the original one is in 2004 from Joel Spolsky, which is an article entitled "Something You Should Never Ever Do" or something like that. And he talks about Netscape, rewriting from version 4 to 5, I think. And he makes a really good point, which says, look, I get why every developer is like, I don't want to deal with this code base. It's so annoying. It's so difficult. Like, we need to rewrite it all from scratch. But as he says, look, you have so much business logic and knowledge in that code base. You're just going to have to rewrite all of it. It's not well documented because it never is, right? And you're going to lose all of it. So think rationally about, we're not trying to optimize for like specific developer feeling good about working in the code base. Like that's a poor business. That's a poor primary point of optimization for a business. Obviously, and how this is usually coached is we have lots of technical debt, and so I can't get development done. And so we have to rewrite all of it. That's also usually completely false. And I think that and we'll get to metrics here in a future slide, but there are metrics. There's good research that shows how you solve these problems of technical debt and developer velocity. It's not rewrite the whole thing from scratch. And so when you start thinking about like, what is it that is the asset? What is the valuable thing you have built? It's really this knowledge and collection of things that are working together, what you put in your code, how you put things together, and that knowledge and understanding that exists on the team to be able to do the amazing thing that software can do, which is modify software as it goes. I mean, the thing that's so incredible about software is that you can have somebody say, ooh, it would be great if it did this thing. And then in days, that thing is done and it's live. And so our entire capability and understanding and ability to leverage that amazing aspect of being able to change software is entirely around having built something that can be modified rapidly and effectively in order to achieve business objectives. Like that's the benefit. That is the amazing asset that you can have. But it's ultimately a complex system. It's not like I wrote this code and it on its own is valuable. I mean, in many of the companies I've started, we had customers who were like, okay, we're worried you're going to go out of business. So put this code in escrow and we'll pay every year. So this code can be in escrow. So if you go out of business, we'll just get the code and run it. And like, that's nonsense. You're not going to be able to do anything with the code. You're not even going to be able to get it running. Like, there's no way. Like, this is a complex system that's a social, technical system that involves people and their knowledge and how they work with things and how they modify it and how they run it. That's the asset, is this complex system. And the more lines of code that you throw into that, the less well that system works. And so you want a more simple system, right? Like fewer like complexities in the system if you can. And so that's the question. Like those, if you're optimizing for those things and you're asking these questions, you're in a better place. At Branch, our software development lifecycle document starts with, we optimize for maintainability. Specifically, we optimize what we build so that the average developer, like average developer that we could hire out on the market, can work with the system that we have. We can bring them in, we can train them, and they can start working and delivering at a reasonable velocity. That's an asset. And so that is how we think about it. That's how we build, and that is very aligned with serverless. So, okay. So let's get to like, what is serverless? Because I want to draw a couple distinctions. I think there are ways you can build serverlessly that are highly inefficient and bad, and you shouldn't. And then there are ways that you can build truly serverlessly that give you these business advantages. So one of my favorite essays that anyone has published is a guy named Steve Yegge, Y-E-G-G-E, and it is called Steve Yegge's Platform Rant. And it is, I think actually the title is called an excerpt. Well, actually, no, I wrote an excerpt from a member to Google employees. I think it's called Steve Yegge's Platform Rant. It used to be published on Google Circles. Remember that social network? It's no longer there, but it is available on a GitHub gist and sort of floating out in the internet. This is where we live. Like we're in like the lore. Yeah, thanks, Mark. We're in like a lore phase of this, but this is an amazing article. And what I want to highlight, if you read it, you may not pull out exactly what I care the most about on it, which is the following. He describes a way of working at Amazon that says this is the 2 pizza team concept. The goal is have autonomous teams that are separate, that write documentation and talk to each other via API, not by people. Now, immediately, if you do that, and by the way, part of this memo that Steve Yegge is describing that Jeff Bezos sends around Amazon that he puts around, I don't know, 2005, 2006, he says, anyone not doing this is going to be fired, is the message from Bezos. So if you have an organization that has lots of small teams that only interact with other teams by documented APIs, you will go very fast, right? There are downsides to this model. Amazon has a bunch of them. And so, and I'm happy to go into those, but what is amazing is you can grow rapidly, right? So you can build these teams, you can make them fully autonomous, and then they all talk to each other very effectively. So, this description, and specifically this description in contrast to Google, which is where Steve Yegge is writing and saying, Google, you don't get it, is helping define a way of thinking which says, if everyone can work autonomously and interact with everybody else by API, then whether the services I'm using are run within my organization or by another company, it does not matter. I will interact with them the same way. This is ultimately, if you buy into this model, and Amazon Web Services in particular have shown us that it is an amazing way to build a company that is highly effective at delivering business benefits to the world. It means that I don't need to have all of it in-house. It means that whether or not to use Algolia again, whether my search service is my search team that builds an API that I interact with, or it's Algolia, an outside company, doesn't matter. It's going to be equally important. All I'm going to care about is, does this thing stay up? Is the documentation good? Does the API work? It also means that if we go back to this concept of how many people does it take to build a scalable social network, I can be one person, and I have all these other departments that I'm gonna be able to interact with, and maybe they don't work for me, but they are going to work with me the same way that's highly effective as what Steve Yegge calls a platform organization, how to think about platform and platform building and platform interaction. So with this framework then, what is serverless? So what embraces a serverless mindset? So I have 2 definitions of serverless. My favorite one is not our uptime. Serverless means if I go down, I can't really do anything about it. Now, there's an asterisk on this, which is if my code took us down, like we wrote bad business logic, then we obviously can fix it. But I'm talking about where infrastructure takes us down, then we wait for infrastructure to come back up. Now, there's a parallel objection to this, right? Which is like, how could you possibly do that? What I would tell you is nobody has complete control over their uptime. Everyone's drawing some line. right? I mean, everyone has an SLA. Every service that's sufficiently long and has been up for sufficiently long and has enough customers goes down for some period of time. Like, all of this is just true. So realistically, what we're asking is, empirically, if I pick managed service providers of a certain caliber with a certain history, how will that compare to me running more of these things myself? And I would say in any empirical examination of this, if you pick appropriately good service providers, they'll beat whatever you could do internally. I mean, it's nonsense to say otherwise. But yet you'll still get that argument, certainly a lot. So that's one argument to serve. One definition of serverless is just if you can control your uptime, it's not serverless. So one example of this is if I'm using Amazon's managed Elasticsearch, that's me. I mean, if that fills up, if that volume fills up, I have to go fix it, right? Amazon's not fixing it. My uptime is directly related to me managing that VM, at least to that extent. They're managing other things on it. They'll do updates on it. But fundamentally, if that goes down, it's on me. I got to fix it, right? To take Algolia again, if Algolia goes down, by the way, I've been using Algolia for 7 years now. I've never seen a second of outage of it, but I'm sure it has had them. I just haven't seen them. I got to wait for Algolia to come back. They're going to do it. So that is the cleanest, simplest definition I can give you of serverless. But Rob Sutter, who is the developer advocate at Amazon Web Services, does have a 4-part definition of serverless, which is no infrastructure provisioning, no management, that's one, automatic scaling, pay for value, and highly available and secure. And I like those. I think those are fine. And if you wanted them to be more robust, fine. I also think there could be a third definition, which is fundamentally that serverless is a focus on business value. And this is Ben Kehoe's serverless mindset. And so he says, very specifically, if you do serverless, you write business logic, and that supports the business, and you don't do other things. You do business logic. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of how to think about a serverless application? So from my perspective, serverless applications have 3 components: front ends, back ends, managed services. So front ends and back ends are things that you write, you maintain, and managed services are managed services you're using to help stitch things together. And so the real question here is about what backends and functions mean, because I think we have a common definition of front ends that is pretty well defined. In a serverless context, this is a Jamstack, or this is some sort of static web hosting of like a single page app, is generally speaking how I view them. Although Brian LaRue of begin.com and Arc Codes has a slightly different view and has been working on a new framework for this. So there are some alternatives to this. But in general, I think there's not a lot of confusion about what a managed service is, and what the front end is. So the real question is, when it comes to a backend, what is fully serverless? And I'll get a little bit more into this in the last section, which is about API hubs and sort of how I think about software architecture. In general, what I like to see is something more like AWS AppSync or Google Firestore, and not like a bunch of Lambda functions through API Gateway. I think those are suboptimal ways of building serverlessly, but I think there's a lot of sort of discussion and nuance and specificity that's worth talking about. But every part of what I'm going to talk about then talks about serverless applications in these parts. Now, I will say in part 4 that goes through specific managed services and vendors, I do break out what I call API hubs, databases, authentication, and functions providers, because those are kind of the key elements of your backend that I think are generally necessary. Although obviously sometimes you don't need all of them. Like if you're doing something static that is available to everyone, then you obviously don't need authentication. So, all right, great. So let's talk objections, right? And this is the last part of the first part and the longest part of the talk, by the way. So what are the common objections that people have when it comes to serverless, as I have seen at least? So the way I see these objections, the number one objection by far is lock-in. There's an intense complaining about lock-in. And, I think that there are a variety of ways of looking at this, but fundamentally, when I think about managed services as lock-in, I just think about what is the effort to write the thing yourself. So we're locked in at Branch to AWS AppSync. Now we spend about $100 a month, or maybe $50 a month, a trivial amount of money on AppSync every month for the benefit we get out of it. So like, even if Amazon like 10x the price, we just wouldn't have, it wouldn't matter. Like we would pay 10x the price. Amazon, please don't 10x our price, but we would pay. I think, but there is this fear that we have that comes largely out of Oracle and maybe a little bit VMware, where those are companies that do audits and find ways of just extracting value, right? There's just a concern that says, I get this certain value out of this product, and so someone's going to come along and they're just going to charge me and rake me over the coals for it. Realistically, though, the amount of hoops people jump through because of the lock-in problem is absolutely absurd. I was recently at a forum of other like CIOs, VP engineering of insurance companies, including like the largest insurance companies in the US. And I had multiple CTO, CIO type people say, well, because Amazon shut down or shut off access to Parler, right? The like right-wing social media site in which people were coordinating the January 6th infiltration of the Capitol, right? And which had really poor security and people were hacking all the time, right? Because I don't know if you remember this, but the reason why we have so many videos from January 6th is because activists hacked into Parler's servers and like pulled a bunch of content off. So Amazon, for a variety of reasons, shut off access to it. And so what we had was, what I had were CIOs and CTOs telling me, hey, because Amazon decided to shut off access to Parler, we have to do a multi-cloud strategy because they could shut us off. And I was like, you're like a major insurance company, public company in the US. Like, how does that go? And one of the people told me with a straight face, well, we use credit score to price insurance, and maybe they'll decide like it's not okay credit score, so we're going to shut off your access. I was like, yeah, Meteor could hit your headquarters too, or like Northern Virginia. Like, these are silly things. Like, this is a truly deeply silly thing. And not only that, you're going to make your entire company, all of your developers, be meaningfully slower and more expensive in everything that they do because of something that isn't going to happen. This is absolutely nuts. But it is in fact like something that people do all the time. And so people have this lock-in belief, but it's about equivalent to that. I think about our lock-in to AppSync as we would have to write our own version of AppSync, and then we can run our code somewhere else. By the way, AppSync has a very well published set of documentation and APIs. We know how it works very well. We could write AppSync, and we've done the exercise. It's a great exercise to do. We've also asked a third-party firm, what would they charge us to write a copy of AppSync? And we have formal spec documents around what it would be like to rewrite AppSync from scratch. That's great risk mitigation. The likelihood that that's ever going to be anything we need to do is close to zero, but I'm willing to spend the time and effort to lay that out. But the reality is when you lay it down and you run the costs out, you've mitigated the risk then, right? So we know exactly what we would do. And even if Amazon decided to like really ramp up the costs and try to put the screws to us on it, there are a variety of ways around this. So really not particularly worried about that. And again, what is the main way that we mitigate this risk? Less code. if code is a liability and I'm trying to minimize the number of lines of code, then what I actually have to port over if I'm making changes or doing anything different is much less, right? It's a lot easier to move your backend functions if it's 10,000 lines of code than if it's 10 million. Next objection that's really common is this loss of control. This is very much the like, I want to touch and feel servers and other people are running these things. I think the problem is in a Kubernetes type environment, that's just an illusion of control. There is no actual, again, fewer lines of code, simpler architectures give you more control, right? The idea that I have a platform team that I can call and yell at and I can control their bonus to get servers up is going to lead me to better uptime just doesn't play out to me logically at all. I mean, you've had to go out on the market, you have to hire people. Most people who are running Kubernetes clusters are running them horribly inefficiently with terrible configuration, usually aren't on latest versions. Usually they're all complaining about how the configurations are too. So, you know, it's no risk mitigation to say run all this yourself and have this illusion of control. Again, you have to be willing to be a pragmatist going for business outcomes for this to be successful, as opposed to you know, trying to optimize for some vague sense of I feel like I'm in control, right? I mean, I'm not going to win that argument. But if we could talk about, we could come up with a formal definition of what is control, what will lead me to like, what is control, where does it matter, and how does it apply if what I care about are business outcomes, right? That's the question. There are a variety of complaints about performance and cold starts. They're largely mitigated. You can mitigate them in many cases. Most of the time, you know, people are eking out performance differences that don't matter, right? Now, look, if you're doing high frequency trading, you know, great. Like, I don't think you're going to be able to use some serverless options, but the number of circumstances in which there is sort of an unachievably fast latency that you require for business outcomes are absolute edge cases. And then, you know, finally, there are a lot of complaints about security. I mean, all I can tell you is I've worked with many different architectures, from on-prem to colo to rack-space managed hosting to Amazon originally, to sort of more infrastructure as code Amazon to serverless. And I got to tell you that the best security that I've ever been able to achieve is in the serverless option. No question. No question. We do rigorous penetration tests every year. At Branch, we never have significant findings. That's never true in any other environment. I mean, we just don't. And again, it's largely because there's a simplicity and there's an outsourcing. So, I mean, when AppSync runs our API backends and Vercel does all of our static hosting, and there's no other way to get into any of our systems from the outside world, like all of our security in terms of standard penetration test level security is being handled by other people. Branch does not have an internal network. We do not have a perimeter. You know, the biggest challenges we run into when we have InfoSec audits are when people say, well, your internal network needs to have a DMZ configured this way. It's like, we don't have an internal network, so I guess we'll stand one up for you. So we'll have like a temporary VPC for a day, so you can go look and see how we would do it if we had it. So, you know, I think, and so happy to talk through other objections that anyone's run into. But there are a lot of good success stories. In the book, I just talk about iRobot, Lego, and the COVID tracking project as just good examples of there are real companies out there that run this. They've been running serverlessly for years, and obviously there's Branch, which we talk about later. It's not a fad; it is meaningfully different, and these companies will tell you how it has been meaningful business difference. Okay, so just a few more. So in each one of these, I think I just have a slide for each one of the sections of the book. But that was a sort of a long walkthrough of the first part of the book, because I think it is probably the most useful definitional outline of serverless, and going to be the part that is the most helpful in helping people understand when I say serverless, I mean a certain thing. So there's then this part that compares Branch, a serverless insurance company, to InsureCo. a typical Kubernetes cluster, you know, sort of best practices organization. I think that, so there are a couple of things I want to describe to you about branch so that you understand some of the details about branch. So at branch, so first of all, what branch is trying to do again is sell insurance, is to have a structurally cheaper price of insurance in the market because of uniquely easy ways to buy the bundle. So most people in America who own homes own cars. Most of them bundle their insurance together. It's really hard to buy together. If you can come in and make it really easy to buy, you are given more opportunities to sell it into a market that doesn't shop. That's sort of the shortest explanation of what branch is doing differently. So branch has to do a number of things. Like we have to build the purchase flow that branch has, we had to build ourselves. Nobody else lets you buy home, auto, umbrella in a single transaction. They just don't. In fact, every other insurance company in the US requires you to basically go on the phone or go in person to an agent, either who works directly for the company or as an independent agent, because that agent has to like learn all these systems and glue all this stuff together and do a bunch of typing and ask you questions like 85 times. That's the difference. Branch has figured out, and we have built this technology and unique interface that enable you to do this bundled purchase that no one else does. In doing so, we cut out a lot of costs. We pass those cost savings back to the customer. Okay. So the question for branch was, what do we build? What are the things we have to build? And so we found a bunch of managed services, especially in insurance. We found a couple services, one called Clarion Door, that would do things like price our policies and generate out our PDFs that are our contract language. Like we didn't need to build a PDF generator. We didn't need to build a like calculate insurance rates system. Right? We could use them, but we had to build the interface, and we had to build the way we were going to store all the data, because if you're going to build an interface that lets you buy this bundle and every other system off the shelf sells them individually, like I got to build a data model. We got to build an interface. You know, there isn't a good way to kind of glue those systems together when we looked into it. We had to build all that ourselves. And so the question was then, if we're going to build all this ourselves, we have to buy things. So we did all sorts of things. Like we did have an initial head of operations who said, we're going to have to do all this insurance-y stuff and everybody builds their own task management system. So let's build it. And I said, let's use Zendesk. And she said, Zendesk. And so she looked at it and she said, well, this won't handle, and then, you know, X, Y, and Z. And I said, well, are we going to need to do any of those in our first 2 years of operation? And she said, well, no. And I was like, okay, great. Let's worry about it in 2 years. And so we did a lot of these things where we said, if we can buy something that'll work for now, we'll be better off. Now, why is that? So I will tell you that over more than 2 decades of software development, any sufficiently large enough software project will, as long as you get to a certain size of what you're building, it will not be successful on launch. Like you get to a certain size, and I guarantee you're just gonna have to iterate after launch, because you're not gonna solve the problem correctly. As scope gets bigger, you're just gonna miss. You won't be able to do the customer discovery or the customer interviews effectively. You will launch it. People will not be able to use it, or you'll have gotten some of the requirements wrong. This is just what happens. If instead you can find something off the shelf that solves sort of 60, 70+% of the problems, and put that into use, and you come up with workarounds and maybe some patches around it. When you do this, you will learn so much, so that when you eventually have to leave this system, because it's 60 to 70% of what you need, you will be able to define the system that you need, and maybe find another system off the shelf that you can do and customize in the appropriate way, because you'll have the specifications. Or when you build it yourself, you'll have a much higher chance of success, because the amount of the scope you're building that's speculative is very low, right? So in all of these cases, we sought in branch to do this sort of buying. I also want to say a couple of things that are interesting about Branch's organization. So Branch does not have front end, back end, DevOps, whatever. Branch has developer. So Branch's developers are front end developers that we teach to be full stack because we're serverless. Branch is JavaScript on the front end, largely TypeScript on the front end, TypeScript on the back end, but JavaScript, underlying both front end and back end. Shared code and packages between front and back end, mono repo. Most of the code in the Branch code base is front end, so in React applications. So there's more code in React applications and shared libraries that those use than there is in back-end functions. And this is largely a function of, this is the serverless mindset. This is how it should be. Most of the time, our software developers are working on interfaces, right? And that's what differentiates us, our interfaces. The goal is to not spend a lot of time writing like back-end business logic, because we're trying to leverage systems that we write configuration-based business logic on top of. So because we do this, and because we lay all this out in this way, we can hire junior developers that go through our own boot camp, who we teach front-end software development, and then over time we teach them back-end functions, which are honestly look a lot like the functions that they would write for the front end. So there's just developer. We don't have DevOps. We don't have dedicated operations. We don't have a platform team. We don't have SREs. We don't have a center of excellence in cloud. We have none of those. We have developers. The more senior developers we have are responsible for being on call when there are problems. Now, when there are problems, again, it's not our uptime. So if Amazon goes down, we're down. Does Amazon go down? Not for us. When you're in these serverless services, it would be regional failure that would be necessary. We were slightly affected by that regional outage that happened, 2 years ago or so, that was like a Kinesis issue that took down a bunch of stuff. So we were affected by that, and we just waited, and it came back up. And it was fine. I mean, I would be very upset. I was upset. I would be upset if it happened again, but it's fine. We have less downtime than any of our competitors, at least in the venture-backed space. So when we think about how do we handle operations, realistically, the operational challenges are when we release new code. So we press a button to release new code, usually once a day. And we make sure our senior developers are around to handle any errors we might have introduced through new code. Although realistically, when people find bugs in code, it's usually several releases later, several days later, because they're edge cases, and we have good automated test cases that handle, the vast majority of use cases. And those developers sort of handle edge cases and are available there. But that's it. That's, and there is, so there, really, there's no sort of 3 a.m. calls. I mean, it's just developers, no operations, no dedicated operations people, developers doing operations. We just have one type of designer. We have UX, UI designers who do both, who are great at both. And we have product managers, and we just have one type of product manager who help manage all that development. So it is a very simple set of people. And the goal is every developer can work on every part of the code base. Front end, back end, we have a React Native mobile app still. So this is very different from the best practices enterprise, right? So if we look at what this InsureCo likely would be, right, we would have lots of different organizations, right? So we would have enterprise architecture, we'd have software, and in software development, we have the database team, the front-end team, the back-end team, the API team, the iOS team, the Android team, the DevOps team, the quality assurance team, right? And we would have a software development lifecycle that's like a design and product and then developers, and they're all in their individual teams. And then the infrastructure team that is responsible for running and then deploying and then running. And all of these things, even if using CI/CD, functionally have a lot of different teams involved and functionally have a lot of, again, the goal would be not a lot of friction. I think the reality is there's a lot different from there's a team of developers and they worry about infrastructure as code and making sure things are up and after releases they're working. And I've got a lot of teams here, and if there's a problem, I got to go chase down who it is, right? And so the challenge then, or the observation in the comparison then, and in this case, I quote Simon Wardley, which is his thoughts on componentization. So this is getting back a bit to the Steve Yegi platform rant. But the reality is most organizations that break up front end, back end, DevOps, SRE, whatever, they're not defining these teams as components that are plug and play, that are API driven, that are highly fungible. Instead, it's highly personal relationships, individuals, and there is a real level of brittleness to that kind of interaction versus our developers having a very, like push button releases to Amazon, Amazon runs. So what happens then if you compare InsureCo to Branch and you think about what is it that we need to do? What are we trying to accomplish? I walked through some specific examples, but Branch, just as a practical matter, Branch has launched more states. So Branch has 4 core lines of business that is initially launched. And so Branch launched 4 lines of business in states at a faster state launch pattern than any other insurance company ever has, including startups like Root, Lemonade, Hippo. One of the fascinating things is that Branch has also done this at a cost of less than 1/30th the development, just pure development, not even DevOps SRE costs, just pure developer costs of some of these companies. Again, this is this observation going back to how many people do you need to build a scalable social network? If you can have this small number of people doing smaller number of things, you will go much, much, much faster than if you have larger teams that you have to coordinate. And so another way to think about this comparison is I often think about success is about being able to have these cycles, right? What I want to do is I want to have an idea. I want to come up with the best way to do it. I want to release it. I want to observe what happens, and I want to do it again. And so the faster I can make these cycles, the better. Now, in a world in which I have lots of different teams, front-end team, back-end team, DevOps, each one of them has to do a cycle in order for me to get anything live, probably multiple cycles. If I have one team and that one team can do a cycle on its own, we're going to run circles around anybody else. And we do. And so it costs less, it's faster, and it's better. And so anyway, happy to answer further question on this, but there is this is laid out, specifically and somewhat pedantically in the book in this section. Okay, last 2 sections. So we have a section on getting to serverless. And so getting to serverless is if you're in an organization that is not serverless and you ask the question, how do I get there? What am I doing? The most important thing, and in my experience, the hardest part is absolutely, is absolutely cultural. And so ultimately, there's a quote that is said a lot that I like, which says, culture eats strategy for breakfast, in which it says, it doesn't matter what your strategy is. If you haven't aligned the culture to the strategy, you won't actually succeed on the strategy. And so, and I've seen this countless times, and my strategies have been eaten by culture in this way. And so, the key here then is to define the strategy and align the culture, define the culture, align the teams, and then you need to exit anybody who doesn't align to it. And until you do that, you're never going to be able to actually get this done as a strategy. Usually, and what I'm used to, is you have a lot of technical leads who draw a lot of self-worth and self-esteem around working within certain technologies. Many of those people may not make it, but it's worth the effort to help them understand that what you're trying to do is achieve a business outcome and not win the Oracle Database Administrator of the Year award. But I think not everyone can be saved here, but I think if you
Oh no.
Oh, Joe, your internet froze.
No, he was on a good rant too.
Yeah. Let's message him.
He'll probably reconnect. It's probably just going to be a brief. Let's see.
And maybe he's not aware. Remember, guy from Italy. It was because of Amen you pasted.
Yeah, it's definitely my fault for putting it. I'll take the blame.
Take the screenshot. This is a good one. Hey, Joe.
I think he's just coming.
Hey, Joe. You're on mute
sorry,
now.
I lost internet,
You're on
but good news that the cellular network is here. We'll keep
That's
going.
okay. Kids on Netflix.
You know, the just scroll back to where I was. You know, the real question is going to be.
It was SQL award of the last thing we heard was Oracle award of the last thing we heard was Oracle award.
Okay, great. Yeah. Sorry. So, you know, you're. Oh, sorry.
And I think the screen is not shared now.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm gonna. Hopefully, the internet will reconnect, and I'll be on that connection again. But in the meantime, I'll hang out on this cell phone here. I think there's some storm going on outside, but it's okay. I promise you, the screen is less useful. So, you know, most organizations are not, and most people in most organizations are not aligned to the business objectives. Oops, here we go. I think I got it. So I'm going to switch back.
What an honor, two of you.
There we go. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. Yeah, most organizations are just not aligned to have people specifically with business goals. Most organizations, especially, have a lot of times will have developers, right? Which they will say, you know, you're a ninja or a rock star, right? And there's this whole identity that's based around the skills you know when we hire you are why we hired you and where you should draw your self-esteem from, as opposed to we're hiring you to be part of our organization, which has organizational goals, and you're gonna, you know, we're looking for you to move along them, but our goal is the organizational goals, not like exercise your skill and a specific skill. To the extent that you're able to realign teams to say, hey, we're trying to achieve this goal, and we recognize that code is a liability. Running our own systems is not necessary or beneficial to us, right? If we don't have to. And you will get paid more money and be more celebrated if you help us on this journey. You can, you know, a lot of people will come along, maybe not all. And so the entire, this section talks a lot about specific tactics and specific cultural conversations that I have seen be successful in this space. But fundamentally, there is a real need, and most of the time should be spent on culture and getting people aligned with the philosophy. And then what you'll find is if people agree with the philosophy, then they will execute pretty well on the tactics. Most organizations fail here because they don't solve the cultural problem, and the cultural problem is hard and takes time. If you get to a point where you have the culture aligned, then it's fairly simple. One, the metrics you want to optimize for are the DORA metrics. So if you haven't read the book Accelerate, main author is Nicole Forsgren. It's the best book about software development that's been written ever. And it will tell you what metrics you should have and what metrics not to have. They're great. The simplest and probably central one is release many times a week if you can, right? At least release once a week. But the more releases you have a week, or let's say if you release at least once a day, twice a day, you don't need to release like every 10 minutes. But releasing every day as a goal will help you get those cycles, right? In this same business objective, you want to release, measure, take that feedback, release again. So if I can release every day and my competitor releases every 2 weeks, I'm 14 times faster than my competitor, or 10 times, depending on if I'm doing weekends, right? If I'm going 10 times, if I get 10 times more cycles than my competitor, I'm going to kill them. I mean, there's just no way. There's no way. I love competing against people who use Scrum and release every 2 weeks. They're never going to catch up. We're always going to know more. We're going to be able to be so much faster. And there are other metrics too that are valuable there. I highly recommend that book, Accelerate. It's great. So if you have the culture, you know what metrics you're optimizing for, the only other
Not my fault this time.
Really storm. Okay, froze again. We don't need slides. Maybe he can continue from the phone.
Yeah, I'd say just give him a minute. He'll be back on the phone. That's probably all we need. I think he's there. He is.
Yeah, we were just saying like you can just talk through the mobile phone.
Yeah, I'll just go through the mobile. Let me. I'm going to turn off this connection here. All right, you can hear me, okay?
Yes.
All right, I'm almost. All right, we're almost done too. So, okay, so the goal here then is if you understand iterative replacement, you understand how you can stick a reverse proxy in place and pick off routes, and you understand that you can start making releases immediately. Again, this is the whole goal of something like iterative replacement of something you're doing. Everyone who has a project which is, okay, we're going to do this whole rewrite, we're going to build it for 6 months, and then we're going to cut over to it, and it's going to be a complete replacement. Those never work. They always die. They're always a waste of money. First of all, they're never done in 6 months. It stretches out. It's 18, it's 24, it's whatever. But you just can't, you're never going to be successful that way. You have to do them in these iterative ways. And if you do them in an iterative way, you will start releasing immediately, which is what you want to do. And then finally, the last part in this section just talks about training and continuing education. And there's a great article by Charity Majors on the new jobs in ops, which is really good. I recommend it. She's talking about in a serverless world, what you could think about. But I think generally speaking, there is no good continuing education in IT. It's a real problem. And the more you can make your organization, one of the things that we do at Branch is when we hire people, and this is easier when you're hiring juniors, but we set the expectation that whatever they're doing and whatever tech they're using today, it's going to be embarrassing if they're using it even in 3 years exactly the same. Like the goal, like technology increases at and improves at a rapid rate. We should be taking advantage of it. And we have every other Friday as a continuing education day. So we let people take essentially the whole Friday to go investigate something and do something and share it. And so that's been incredibly effective. And so having a culture of learning, having a culture of sharing, and setting an expectation with everyone that you should not draw all of your pride in, I know this technology and I'm using it forever. That's really important. And if you do all this, you'll have a massive hiring advantage. Branch, the number of people who come to us and say, oh, well, I bet you're having trouble hiring developers and help us out. Like, we'll help with that. I mean, we don't have any trouble. We go hire and train people ourselves, and we have just much better economics on it, and we have no problem filling positions. It's not difficult. So finally, the last section of the book is a managed services directory, and it is broken into a number of sections or a number of chapters. One of them is on API hubs. So API hubs are what I think make the most sense to build serverlessly from scratch if you can. So my favorite of these is AppSync, AWS AppSync, and how it connects with Lambda and Cognito and DynamoDB. And it has other connections too. My second favorite is Google Firestore. Google Firestore has a great connection with Algolia and Google Cloud Functions and Google Cloud Storage. I think what has happened within Firebase and Firestore over the last few years has been really fantastic. It's a really good product. It's very good. And then as soon as you stop with those, there is like a pretty strong drop off because there's no other cloud driven like ecosystem for building these applications. That said, there are a couple other options that I think exist. So Fauna, the database with Netlify or Vercel, and then Auth0 for authentication, I think is like a reasonable additional version. And there's a startup called Supabase, which is interesting. I don't think it's actually fully serverless by my definitions, but it is also an interesting option there. Also, Netlify has an interesting GraphQL-based way of talking with specific other managed services that's kind of cool and fits into this same environment and ecosystem for API hubs. But I like using a hub for handling all that API traffic so that you don't have to run something like in JavaScript Express or run a web server. Anytime you're running a web server, you're having to handle routes individually as opposed to using a framework API hub. I think you're doing undifferentiated heavy lifting there. The other sections of the directory, the managed service directory I have, are authentication. So there's a bunch of options here. Again, there are the cloud providers themselves. There's also things like Auth0, a couple other choices there. There's a bunch of serverless databases that are great. One that we use Cognito at Branch, we use Cognito. We use Dynamo at Branch, but we also use this great serverless Postgres database called Neon. That's actually, we use it in production even though it's still in beta. It's a phenomenal product if you're looking for like true serverless Postgres. It's the only thing out there. Basically, any of these platforms, if you make a choice about your API hub or your authentication or your database, like you're going to have some way of running functions, but there's a lot of different ways to run backend functions. That's simple. So many people think serverless is serverless functions, and so go look at that first. The reality is most of these things can run whatever function you're looking for, and so you'd be better off making these other architectural choices before you do functions. And then finally, I have a really robust list of other managed services, and this one is the longest chapter in the book because it just goes through lots of services that I think are fantastic. And my bet is that if you read this, you're going to find services that you have not heard of that will be interesting. And so and I plan on keeping updating this list. So anyway. That was my long walkthrough of my book. Happy to answer questions now, and I can go into whatever. So I don't know, Dan, if you want to ask the questions. I don't know if I can see them here. So
Well, they're in the chat, but you cannot probably see them all. First off, thank you so much. This is amazing. And before you had the book, we were just following you and getting the ideas for meetups. I was telling folks 20 to 30% of the topics we had were inspired on the stuff we learned from you. So. Thank you for that. John, you want to start reading the questions in the chat?
Oh, you want me to look at the questions?
Yeah, why not?
Anyone can speak up if they have a particular question. Yeah. There was one posted in the Q&A, so we can start with that one. Let me just see how to get to the Q&A. It was just, can you please once again draw a comparison between serverless and managed services?
Oh, well, yeah. So I've used serverless as this general philosophy around how you're going to build an application, and managed services as specific point solutions. And so I can have a non-serverless application that uses managed services. In fact, I would say most modern applications today use some managed services and are not serverless. And so to me, serverless is getting to that, not our uptime and those criteria.
So I have one.
Still here?
Yep. So I have one I sort of mentioned. You talked about, I'm on the same page as you are when it comes to Kubernetes, for example, but I'm fighting now the managed Kubernetes and managed Kubernetes in AWS with Fargate, for example, and people insisting that that makes it a serverless solution. To me, that doesn't add up. I mean, you're still managing a lot of stuff, but at some point there comes to be this line, and how do you justify, really you're still managing something. Okay, yeah, you're not managing the compute, you're not managing these other things, but you're still doing CRDs and all this other stuff. Like, how do you justify that when you get hit with that argument?
Oh, I mean, I keep asking this. I mean, in that case, my argument is, would we be better off if we had to hire a specialized team of people? I mean, my general view on Kubernetes is you're going to have, at scale, you'll have to have 4 people, presumably. I mean, you can't have just one because that person has to go on vacation. So you're going to have at least 2 people who have a specialized skill set. So you're opting into, as soon as you choose Kubernetes, you're opting into, I'm going to have 2 people. Presumably they're each going to make at least 150 grand a year, but fully loaded, maybe closer to 200, 175. I don't know. I mean, presumably, I mean, this is like your services are going to go down if they're not set up properly. So presumably that's what you're in for, at least initially, right? And anytime you want anything done, you're going to have to interact with those people. And so they're going to add an additional cost and slowness to deployment. So the question is, if we didn't have to have them, would it be better, right? If we could get away with not having them, would we be better off? That's the question that I usually have within an organization. If I could tell you, here is $400,000 back to get you more velocity, would you take it? Or would you go, no, I'd rather have, these people who are hard to hire and have a specialized skill set?
Oh, heck yeah. Okay.
I mean, you can't. I mean, the problem is sometimes the books are cooked here, right? You get someone saying, well, we already have it, or you get someone saying, well, it's not possible to do what you want to do on serverless because, and then they'll come up with something that is avoidable, but has been thrown in to be a particular kind of wrench in things to make things difficult.
Thanks.
What else do we see here? Thoughts on language of choice for the cloud. That's question by Bill.
I mean, I will never leave JavaScript at this point in time. I think ES6, ever since we got ES6, it's phenomenal. I think TypeScript is great in its own right. Realistically, and maybe we'll get to a point where WebAssembler enables other languages like that are meaningfully good. But the reality is JavaScript is the native language in the browser. If you want to build effective front ends, you're going to be in JavaScript. And so as soon as you have that choice, it's great to have shared code and shared packages between front and back end. I just can't tell you how much time and pain it saves to do that. And so it just gets that much easier to make those choices. Now, there are a variety of arguments. I think Brian LaRue is probably the best sort of anti-view, although I think he's very pro JavaScript, but his general view is anti-single page apps, would just much prefer to keep everything in HTML. My view is that with small enough teams, I think you can do whatever. But I think if your goal is to do this at scale over time, and you want to do this in any kind of sustainable way over time, then JavaScript is just going to beat every other option. And things like React are going to beat every other option because they work, they do scale. And so many of these other options just run into technical debt as you try to scale teams or run it for a long period of time.
Cool. We have Praful raised hand.
Hi there. I have one question for you. So, as growing in a serverless architecture, do you prefer CDK approach or you prefer direct cloud formation?
We write direct YAML executed by SAM. I have conversations about this all the time. My view is, so my reason for not liking CDK is what I think of as the unintended consequences of making changes. So in general, the worst the worst bugs that we run into as an organization are ones where, like, what happens is somebody writes some dried up generalized code, call it like general config X, right? And then somebody writes a specific version of it, specific config that inherits the general config and has some other specific thing, an object, a class, whatever it is. And then somebody's like, ooh, I'll descend off that for some reason. But they won't update all the comments. They won't update everything. And so it will be non-obvious that there's this middle definition of something, a function, an object, a struct, or whatever it is, middle definition of something that is actually descended and used in other places. And so someone will change something that looks specific, but actually is somewhat generalized, and that will cause unintended consequences. And in CDK land, that is easy. And that is actually, I mean, the benefit of CDK is that you can dry up config like code. The problem is you can do things and like delete your Cognito user pool by accident or something like that. I mean, I don't know if I built an exact example in which I can show a clean delete of a user pool, but I can definitely show examples where you have far too permissive like IAM roles unintentionally. Now, we live in a world of having some junior developers, right? Generally speaking, having lots of junior developers. And so my goal is to create environments in which it is hard to make mistakes. And so in my view, CDK, I'm okay with the mistakes in code. My view is that CDK just makes it too easy to have unintended consequences in infrastructure, and that it is better to do something that makes it harder to have unintended consequences with your infrastructure, because that has much worse consequences than unintended consequences in your code, which generally are fairly easy to rectify after the fact with migrations or whatever the other options are. That said, you know, if I had serverless and I had to deal with a bunch of like EKS configuration and EC2 configuration, like I would be drifting more toward CDK, just because I do think that there is a level of impenetrability in the YAML. The reality though is that, I mean, we're a full stack insurance company, and the amount of YAML we have is like single digit thousands of lines of YAML. We have a mono repo. We're broken into 12 different CloudFormation stacks. Each CloudFormation stack has no more than about 400 lines of YAML. Most of them are more like 200. So it's just not that hard to work with, even for a junior developer. So we don't have a lot of pain around the YAML. And I definitely don't want to introduce the unintended consequences of the CDK.
And also one common I found, I have a similar, because I'm right now working on both CDK as well as CloudFormation. I found CloudFormation is creating so much disciplined code versus written by many developer in the many way to the CDK.
Yep, and I think you're right. Yeah, you get, there's an inherent style guide to YAML that is enforced basically by what it is that isn't true in CDK. Ben Kehoe also has the complaint about CDK that CDK creates the YAML, but you don't exactly know how. And so it's a bit magical. And in the way that like Angular, or at least Angular 1.1.4 was so painful because it would do things and you would say like, why is it doing it that way? It's just too magical. In the same way, CDK can end up a little magical. I think they've fixed a lot of that, but Ben's point is it's infrastructure and I want to know exactly what it's doing, and I don't, as another complaint to CDK. So sorry, Mark.
Yeah, sorry, Praful, I didn't want to cut you off there, but you'd mentioned when you talked about Joel Spolsky's article, don't do this. I think I heard you said you had some other examples of articles.
So DHH has an article, although I think DHH has done a lot to sort of hurt his reputation recently. But David Heinemann Hansen, the creator of Ruby on Rails and Basecamp, 37 signals. He wrote an article called Rewrite, in which he says you should rewrite, but you shouldn't rewrite the same thing. If you rewrite, use the knowledge of what you have done so far to write something that is much better in architecture. And I think that's totally correct as well. I think that the idea that you you have to have such terrible technical debt to rewrite an exact replica of a program. And I'll tell you that every time I've seen it happen, I've seen effectively like one developer on a shoestring budget do a better job of refactoring the original code than I have seen like a team of like 100 people with like an $8 million budget a year rewrite it from scratch. And it's just because it's so hard. I mean, you can write test cases around code that exists, and you can go just do the hard work and refactor it. And it is just a much less risky thing, and it is much easier than to rewrite from scratch. But it is a time-tested truth that developers would much rather rewrite things from scratch into greenfield projects than clean up and refactor a brownfield program.
You know, they say junior developers, the first thing they want to do is write new code. Senior developers want to delete code, and
right.
Really senior developers look for ways to not have it in the first place, right?
Yeah, I think good senior developers, yes, absolutely. And I do think, I mean, I think that I think a lot of this is like aligned incentives and expectations. You know, the best ways I've seen technical debt handled are going out and specifically hiring people who are going to clean it up and who have compensation that is like very rich and tied to specific metrics and milestones, and also breaking up, you know, have somebody write the tests, write all the tests, and then hire someone and say, we got all the tests, go at it. And you're going to get paid a ton of money to fix this and meet these metrics. And whether it's like fewer lines of code or whatever those end up being, like really doing it. And I just, you know, I think it's one of those things that there are so many senior non-technical executives and senior technical executives who view software development as kind of magic. And then the people actually doing the work they'll talk to, and those people will say, well, I need X. And they'll just go, okay. And apply no logic or a rational sort of approach to it.
Cool. We have a question, Anonymous. Great talk. Is there a backend for TypeScript? No, then it means there is a server on which backend runs. So I'm reading.
I mean, TypeScript will run on Node.js. You just compile it. So yeah, use Node as your backend, and or Dino.
Okay, and when you were talking about backends, in my head it was databases, like, and I know you use BigQuery and DynamoDB. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, right. So I mean, you run your TypeScript on your functions as a service platform, whatever that is. So at Branch we have AppSync, and then AppSync will execute Lambda. So you'll make an API call to the AppSync API, and depending on what you send and how it's set up, sometimes that will actually go execute Node.js running compiled types. TypeScript just compiles JavaScript, so it's just running the compiled JavaScript on that input that AppSync gets.
Cool. Any other questions? We have 12 minutes left, but before we go, I wanted, Joe, we lost you again. Are you with us?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm still here. I'm like on the move. I realize I have to pick up my daughter from swimming, so I can talk to you. But I have to get them into a car.
Any other questions? We have 12 more minutes. So
there's still a raised hand there, but maybe we covered that one. Praful, do you have another question?
No, I think he covered very clearly with examples, so I'm good. Thanks.
Okay, that's just the Google Meet thing then. Any other questions?
Yeah, I don't have a question as such. My question is already answered, but I would like to thank Joe and just share my experience of serverless. Basically, I worked around 3 years back in the serverless environment, and what my observation has been, it's the same experience which I had around 10 years back when I'm primarily from Java background, but somebody asked me to do something in Ruby on Rails 10 years back. And in Java, we have tons and tons of configuration files. And then when I ventured into ROR, and it was convention over configuration. So you reduce the number of configurations so that you avoid making mistakes. So you go by convention. And that's what I felt when I worked with serverless, that amongst the solid principles, it enforces the single responsibility principle very well. That it enforces you to think about that. Because when you try to go serverless, you try to think about functions or functionalities with single responsibilities. So yeah, my first instance has been obviously as enthusiastic as Joe's is. My only worry is when I meet senior executives or the enterprise architects and CTOs who are very obsessed with serverless, as it was in that organization, and then it's become sometimes slightly dangerous, because when somebody's over obsessed about something, either he has attended a paid free training from any cloud provider, or he has recently done a certification on that. So though that implementation didn't go as well as it should have been, because the enthusiasm of the organization was purely driven by just adopting it, not designing around it.
Yeah, and I think a good way to identify this problem, I describe this as the functions as a service problem. I wrote an article called the Serverless Sea Change, I think about 4 years ago, for InfoQ, that actually goes through and talks about why I like this AppSync API hub architecture better than what I would call the functions as a service architecture. And the I distinguish the difference here between, if the goal is everyone's like writing a bunch of functions on API gateway and they're building these like massive microservice graphs, then they're absolutely not doing what I would think is the right way to do it. And in fact, when I talk to organizations about adopting serverless, I mean, initially what I want them to do is just use a managed service, not actually write any functions. And so something like Algolia or Cloudinary or Upstash for Redis or Basis Theory for tokenization, or I mean, there's this litany of these, Flat File for file ingestion. There's so many, DocRaptor for PDF generation. There's so many of these services. And I think that if your first step
is using a managed service instead of having any of your own code anywhere, I think that's the thing to get into the mentality. And I think if everybody can understand that, like, hey, we're using Twilio instead of using our own telephony cards and our own physical machines, right? And we keep applying that lesson. Once you've done that enough times, I think you get the idea that says, okay, well, how could we apply this to the core of the application? And that's really where this sort of AppSync API Hub or Firestore comes in. And that's really where you can ask these questions of how can I fundamentally architect these applications a bit differently so I don't have to run a web server. But I think the gateway drug is always, how do I get you using managed services? And then how do I get you to think about how could I apply that pattern to everything, such that the managed service I'm using is actually like an API hub for my custom code. But I agree with you.
Joe,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, just one last thing, that is your any of the contact information available anywhere to connect for any advice or any discussion?
Sorry. The best way to contact me is on Twitter, which I'm just at Joe Emison, and you can DM me on Twitter and talk to me. My email address is joe@branch.com, but you'll get more attention by tweeting at me, especially if you tweet at me like specific questions and we have a public conversation. That's definitely the best way to talk about things. Although, again, happy to handle DMs on Twitter, but a lot of times my work email gets very prioritized for work.
Got it.
We have 4 minutes before 8. Bill has one more question. How can we best find out about Managed Service Directory website? I understood it's your book.
Yes, you should. You got to buy the book. Got to pre-order the book. No, we'll have a website at some point in time. We're working out exactly where. But yeah, you can also. I mean, feel free to hit me on Twitter. I can I can also give you the names of a bunch of managed services so you can take a look at them. But yeah, and also if you had a specific, if anyone has a specific question, like, hey, I think there should be a managed service that does X. I always find those very interesting, and so we end up building them. I'll give all of you here another one that I love that people seem to not know about, which is if you build serverlessly, you can't get a fixed IP address from which to make requests. And that can be a problem because there are sometimes third-party vendors you'll work with who will say, well, you need to tell us what IP address you're making requests from so that we can whitelist you into the service. And so there's a great service called QuotaGuard, QuotaGuard, which just gives you fixed IP addresses to use through an HTTP proxy. It's a great product. We use it for many services at Branch. It's highly useful. So, but anyway, it's services like those that you'll get in the book.
That is awesome. And we're almost to the end. Like, I want to put everything in perspective here, social context. Like, you are disrupting insurance industry, and on the news, as you have these extreme weather conditions, fires and floods, if lots of Americans cannot afford it. I know, and I know that you have nonprofit organization helping Americans, Safety Nest. Can you kind of say something about that, Javier?
Sure. You know, one of the things that we wanted to do, there's a variety of things. If you raise venture capital and you are successful for your investors, you are also able to do the things you want to do, provided they fit into the overall mission. And so, you know, my ability to hire junior developers and build a development organization in the way we have has made our company much stronger and better, but is also generally doing good. And another way that when we set up the company initially, there is a significant problem in the United States around underinsured or uninsured drivers. About 13% of drivers on the road in the US are uninsured. And one of the most expensive things that we pay for in insurance in America is the uninsured motorist coverage. Because if you get hit by someone who isn't insured and you don't have that coverage, you're just damaged, you're injured, and physically, and or your car, and there's nothing really you can do about it, because usually people who are uninsured, if you sue them, they don't have enough assets for you to collect against them. And so we have a nonprofit called Safety Nest. You can go to safetynest.org to look at it, but we are working on tackling, understanding, and ultimately solving that uninsured motorist problem across the US. And it is a long journey, because there is not another nonprofit, nor has there been much research at all into what is the extent of the problem, other than calculating what percentage of drivers appear to be uninsured. But beyond that, you know, no one has really asked the question, how could we solve this problem? What is this problem? And what can we do? And so we have been doing a lot of experiments and a lot of research, and still very early in the journey, but it's something that a lot of people at Branch are really passionate about.
Thank you for sharing. Any closing thoughts, John? Anybody? Like Joe, thank you so much for your time.
I have nothing else. Thank you very much for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Likewise.
Yes, thank you very much, Joe.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, have a good rest of your week.
Go buy the book. Yep, go
Yeah,
buy the book,
buy
and
the
we'll
book.
connect when we read it again.
Yes, thank you.
Ciao. Bye.
All right. Bye.